She's in the push me, pull me of she can't do this. Why did she say she would do this? What were they thinking? Yesterday, when they spoke on the phone, making a plan for the writing, it seemed okay. They went through the abstract to give a shade to this, to make sure they attended to what they had promised to deliver, good girls always. They laughed as they acknowledged that it wasn't easy grappling with dialogue, especially dialogue about sex. As Angel says, my experience is just mine, yet individual stories are important not because they can wholly represent anything else, but because they insist on specificity, on experience, on detail. They can give voice to what is silenced in polemical debate, and they give space to the complexity within each sexuality. So no corpus for me then, only some bodies.
What is sex? Atwood argues that today sex may be an out-of-body experience, very intimately performed across time and distance, an act of presentation and a representation which is consumed as quickly as it is produced, a way of articulating or disarticulating identity. It was midsummer when I arrived, the morning after the night before, a day later than planned. No walk of shame as my van pulled up at Davina's, but celebration of the unexpected, an edge-pushing madness of my life, and the sexual experimentation and deep connection that happens once the floodgates of possibility are open. And amongst this we chatted about how we'd met at QI in 2015 and about what had happened there. I was trying to write a report of what I'd seen as the patriarchal charades without damning my yet-to-begin career. And Davina had a secret to share. The gin and conversations flowed. Davina was writing and I was off visiting schools and entertaining the locals on the nature of speeches. Our friendship gelled. I'm not sure how it happened really. Probably in our chat about chapter 6 for Davina's PhD, about sex dating and orgies and fantasies, and that not spoken about subject of female ejaculation, let alone orgasm. This wasn't a secret, as Davina was a pro. We traipsed upstairs, laid down a waterproof sheet on the bed. Who doesn't have one of those? And together, on the bed, we removed our clothes. And I watched with keen observation and awe. The long mirror at the end of the bed elongated and framed our bodies, the firm and pert older one and the curvaceous younger one. Beautiful, erotic, and so much in our feminine power. Here I was learning a secret of womanhood, a passing down of sex magic and skills to release me from my current box of identity. We giggled later about what if there'd been a webcam. And yes, someone might have got off on it, as we did. But there was something deeper going on here.
Oh my God. Really? You really want to say it like that? I mean, so brazenly? What ethical responsibility do we have to be aware of each other's uncomfortableness and embarrassment? I am so much more comfortable with the third person than the first person narrative. It gave a way to give permission to myself when I was using personal stories in the PhD. I always write the autobiographical and autoethnographic in the third person. It's another iteration of the changing focus, allowing a stepping back and to the side, aligning myself with the absent others that populate my text. It also softens the terror of judgment that I feel with the revelation of very private and intimate details, in the case of my PhD, of my own grief process, because it fictionalises. We are formed from, as Clarendon and Connolly say, an I who learns by seeing and telling stories along the way and who writes stories of relationships. Why did she suggest teaching her? Because once an educator, always a fucking educator? Because it was a way of connecting the raw sense of power and control it gives her to the stories of transgressive and extreme sexual acts being told to her? Containment, control. So much of our lives, her life, is about trying to control her body, how it looks, smells, functions. But it's illusory, this containment, There is a tussle, a power struggle. She can feel herself stretched and straining like the very seams of her being will rip. She could talk lyrically of the dripping, fecund ripeness of reawakened sexuality and eroticism that is like an embodied Dylan Thomas poem, all alliterative vowels and rolling, lilting exuberance. She could talk of possession, feeling like some external spirit, possibly that of her dead mother or dead partner, is invading, unsettling her sense of self, getting her to step ever nearer the edge of extremity.
With you, not with other friends, as they are spectators, with you, our sexual stories are becoming entwined. The words of Nin give new meaning to our friendship. Each friend represents a world in us, a world possibly not born until they arrive, and it is only by this meeting that a new world is born. Two women, one post and the other pre-menopausal, meet and become friends. They both have a story to tell in terms of their own relationship to sex and sexuality and sexual liberation. Their journeys collide and share deeper interactions. Their dialogue and personal journeys help them to deepen their friendship and to unpick their living with shame, identity, connected to sex-positive identities.
Or a pre-climacteric and post-climacteric woman, as Greer would insist, knowing that menopausal is a social construct that smacks unhealthily of a prurient interest of a male-dominated medical profession, a wish to deny grief of a body ageing, changing, though her argument, it seems, does not encompass the rediscovery of a more sexed body.
The performance of friendship in our research method and writing is intended, as Raymond suggests, to be a thoughtful passion that engages our thinking hearts so that we may better understand the circumstances in which we found ourselves, the possibilities for linking the personal and the political, and for the imaginings we have about the potential of friendship as research method, holding on to the interrelated ideas that talk is a substance of women's friendships, and dialogue a central tenet of feminist research. For you, grief, living with grief through sex dating, the blatant, private, invisible online record of wants and desires, the short-lived interactions, the line between private and public, and that many of these men, they too were grieving, even if your need was silent.
Frobber identifies that living with our losses can allow risk-taking. He also suggests that people who dwell on their mortality can be viewed as suspect. They break a taboo, cross a boundary. There is, for me, a transgressive element in the embodied viscerality of physical loss that links to messy bodies, seemingly being both in control and out of control, eroticism and sexuality, haunted and taunted by intensity and authenticity. I searched for accounts of increased libido in connection with grief, worried that my own experience was way outside the normative. Berland says that sex requires irrational exuberance and that the collaborative risk of shared disorganisation disturbing the normative. Yet I found few examples in autobiographical literature that talked of this aspect of grief. I found even fewer academic references that explore specifically the link between the intensity of grief and a searching for an equivalent intensity through sexual encounter. Though it's acknowledged by Leda that the death of a parent or someone truly loved can produce the little discussed phenomenon of intense, wild and unrestrained sexual desires. He also suggests that sexual thoughts are experienced with unusual intensity and frequency. This need for intensity speaks to me of a yearning to find equivalency in the intensity of grief. For you, single and free in her 30s, beginning to explore her sexual identity, to learn how bodies desire through Tantra, BDSM and Burning Man radical free expression, orgasm being quick, though self-love and clitoral stimulation, edge playing and extreme playing at the peripheral of acceptable, many hands, many bodies, fantasies realised, fulfilling utopian bucket lists of others.
iterative skill sharing moves between our embodied phases in our lives. Mine is a cyclical menstrual woman, following Gray. This cyclical nature is also visible in my understanding of my rhizomatic nomadology of existence and the different viewpoints, the multiplicity of the Alys we that embodies this world that I'm exploring in my PhD. It also can be seen in the interactions from Barrow between Davina and myself, the learning to come leading to the taking to the orgy. And that's what happened. 2 months later, up the stairs we went, no walk of shame, but a tush, wiggling celebratory walk of freedom. Finding space is tricky when the genteel rooms of the stately home are covered with mattresses filled with writhing bodies. Best come early, so to speak. We found space in the back room, and the three of us began to play. When I enter an orgy space, I try to free myself from the present reality. It's like mindfulness for the liberated generation. A moving meditation of sexual pleasure. I move into a gender-less space. I didn't really think Davina has never been to one of these before. I just assumed she'd be fine. Now that is dangerous. But she likes to fuck. And here is plenty of chances to fuck. No thoughts that she normally fucks in private for other reasons. My night continued, flowing between bodies in innumerate patterns. And it wasn't until emerging later, sharing jokes of security and banter in the hot tub, that I began to wonder, where is Davina?
She feels. That's how she always starts, but it's complicated. She feels. It suggests she knows, is clear. It's not that simple. There is a car crash of emotions, thin-skinned, so goddamn vulnerable. She has retreated, cosy in her tent, but feeling tearful. Did she want to fuck in a room full of other people fucking? Well, it challenged her boundaries. It was the purpose of the weekend, so if she didn't do it, a sense of failure would haunt her. Where was the intimacy? Then something happened that was not okay. Everything wobbled. That is unacceptable to me. But how does she voice that and feel safe, not knowing the rules? The one condom, two women situation. She was confronted by her inability to ask for what she needed, to know what it was she needed, and then ask for it. She is shocked at not being able to say no in the moment. She didn't trust her own sense of that's not okay. Why was she so worried about how she would look in that peer group? There was an incipient fear that she would be ostracised, become an even more peripheral participant than she was feeling. She thought she was wild, but in comparison with this community, she is an innocent. She feels wide open and scared.
I wonder what the audience are thinking. Although these events have long lists of ethics and safer sex practices, what happened to us that night, the two women, one condom situation, a penis without a brain, is not in the list. Nor does it seem to appear in key texts on polyamory and swinging culture, like the ethical slut and more than two. Consent and integrity are key guidelines.
And what happened that night, unfortunately, wasn't about integrity. It was about following lines of personal flight, peripheral to the goings-on around the others, that were integral to the orgiastic activity because consent had been violated.
Neither he nor you had been to an orgy before, something I somehow took for granted, and we had not talked in advance about the emotional impact of the experience. View and Ricker did explain, if you've never had group sex before, it can trigger unexpected responses. Sex tends to be dynamic, messy, complicated business, and you won't be able to script the entire encounter. Easton and Hardy explain that swinging has offered many a heterosexual woman her first opportunity to explore greedily and guilt-free sexuality. In fact, we often hear of women who attend the first swing party very reluctantly, their second one hesitantly, and their subsequent ones avidly. And I have been to several events since, but has Davina? For it is true this so-called radical weekend still had aspects of the schoolyard, the hierarchies and the beautiful cliques fucking so delightfully in the corner. It wasn't the utopia I had envisioned and sold. We saw the petite bourgeoisie that Janos argues of the late modern hedonistic sexuality in full swing. For this group, a view of sex as fun and a corresponding concern of sex as aesthetic rather than ethic had functioned as a means of defining itself as sophisticated and as a way of distinguishing itself from a stuffy and unliberated older bourgeoisie. There is a danger living this sex-positive life, of forever questioning the normative way of being, becoming, of never finding what you are searching for continuing to make fantasies into reality to no given gain. Bauman calls these people sensation seekers who must cultivate the capacity for endless stimulation and an openness to new experience. He goes on to explain the dangers of expectation that sex will continue to provide us with new and endless pleasures means that the ultimate sexual experience remains forever a task and no actual sexual experience is truly satisfying. And I wonder if this was happening to me until I fell in love.
For me, there's a link between mourning and explorations of sexuality. Cavage talks of queering mourning that has meant overruling reticence with the antagonistically explicit. But he notes that to assert that mourning entails a phenomenology of pleasure remains as provocative today as it was when Abraham suggested to Freud that a fair number of people show an increase in libido and heightened sexual needs some time after bereavement. It felt like dangerous territory to step into for my PhD thesis, and yet it had to be present. Otherwise, I was allowing a fear of judgment and disapproval to skew the presentation of my own experience. Who is in the empty chair? The dead man. How many dresses, pairs of shoes, pairs of matching underwear, sex toys, fucks does it take to fill the space of his absence? A lot, it seems. The small house becomes more full of stuff and more devoid of space. Compensation, perhaps, for the huge gaping abyss that she teeters on the edge of, sometimes lowers herself down into with ropes and safety helmet, and then on occasion recklessly flings herself in, not caring of the implication, the repercussions, the bruised limbs, the potential danger, instead revelling in the adrenaline rush of danger, pushing beyond what is sensible, safe, and finding others willing to do the same. A seeming equivalence to the decision to wash and prepare the dead man's body, his corpse. Engage with the visceral process of weight, spoilt goods, cold, clammy, warm skin. Absence, presence. None of it even comes close to that experience. But what does come near to it is the fear and anxiety about writing about the sexual liaisons. She can talk about it with humour, a deftness that seems to shock and amuse in equal measure, a delicate balance that she is unsure she can maintain in the written word, and yet there is a need not to hide it, to not tidy the cushions, to say this messy process is as much a part of the process of her grief as any other. A justification, perhaps, a giving voice to choices and connections, perhaps, a passionate belief that in telling the story the space is created, where alternative stories could be told by other people, where one's own and others' judgments could be acknowledged and challenged, perhaps. And this panel has the title of Shame, ? And how has that influenced the sharing or not of our personal stories, of us two women and our barely containable sexuality? It's useful to draw upon Probyn here and her argument that shame is simultaneously in our bodies, at the core of ourselves, and in our social relations.
However, if we adhere to Probyn's definition that shame can be a powerful and potentially destructive and violent way to patrol the borders of normality, then our voices could have shamefully been silent. But if we follow Probyn's later suggestion that in shame our habitus becomes reordered, shaken up, it admits other possibility and in turn allows for more interest to be registered. Then we have a sense of power from living with shame.
And that links to my PhD explorations of learning to live with and alongside grief rather than the dominant narrative of getting over it and living on.
Of a becoming more embodied in our true selves. This whole dialogue could not have happened if we had not become friends and through that becoming explored our lives, our sexuality. Thank you.